For 1,000 years, Poland told itself a story. It was a simple story, the kind every nation tells about its own beginning. The story said that Poland's first kings were homegrown Slavic warlords, men who rose out of the local soil, united scattered tribes through sheer will and steel, and built a kingdom that would stand at the eastern edge of Christian Europe for the next 1,000 years. It was a story of local blood, local roots, local destiny. Scientists just tested that story against the actual DNA sitting inside the royal tombs. And the story lost. This is the tale of the House of Piast, the dynasty that founded Poland, and the strange, decades-long forensic investigation that just rewrote everything historians thought they understood about how that nation came to exist. It involves opened coffins, mixed-up bones, secret laboratories built specifically to avoid contaminating 1,000-year-old DNA, and a genetic signature so rare that scientists could only find 3 other matches for it anywhere on Earth. And when they traced those matches, none of them pointed toward Poland. They pointed toward Viking graves in England, Roman cemeteries in the Netherlands, and Iron Age burial sites in France. Let's start with why anyone would even attempt something this difficult. Royal genealogy sounds glamorous, but reconstructing the genetic history of a medieval dynasty is one of the hardest problems in modern archaeology. Bones decay. Coffins get looted, moved, opened by careless hands centuries before anyone thought to test DNA. Names get attached to skeletons based on tradition rather than evidence, and those traditions are wrong more often than anyone would like to admit. For most royal families in history, we simply don't have reliable remains to test at all. The handful of successful cases that do exist read like a highlight reel of exceptional luck. Scientists identified King Richard III of England beneath a parking lot in Leicester. They identified fragments of Hungary's King Bela III and his wife, Anna of Antioch, from a destroyed basilica. They pulled genetic information from a descendant of Alexander Nevsky, one of the storied Rurikid princes of medieval Russia. But in every one of those cases, researchers were working with a single person, maybe 2. A single skeleton can tell you about one individual's ancestry, but it can't tell you about a dynasty. It can't prove a bloodline persisted across generations. For that, you need many bones, from many burials spanning centuries, and a way to prove they're actually related. That's exactly what a team of Polish scientists set out to do with the Piasts. And the reason the Piasts made sense as a target isn't sentimental. It's because Poland has unusually rich physical evidence. The Piast dynasty ruled for hundreds of years, and members of the family were buried in known, tracked, historically documented locations. 2 cathedrals in particular stand out. The first is the cathedral in the city of Płock, which served as the burial site for 12 generations of Piasts spanning 4 centuries, both the main royal line and a related branch called the Masovian Piasts. According to old records, 18 family members were laid to rest there. The second major site is the cathedral in Warsaw, where 4 more Piasts were interred, the final representatives of the Masovian branch of the family before it died out entirely. On paper, this sounds like a gold mine. In practice, it turned into an enormous puzzle because what researchers found when they opened these graves rarely matched what the historical labels told them to expect. Back in the 1970s, archaeologists and anthropologists in Płock had opened the royal chapel and the crypt beneath it, gathered up the skeletal remains they found, and sorted them into 18 separate containers, each one labeled with the name of the historical figure believed to be inside. It seemed straightforward at the time. It was not straightforward at all. When the modern research team went back decades later and re-examined every one of those containers, taking multiple samples for DNA analysis and radiocarbon dating, the results told a messier story. The radiocarbon dates for the bones did line up broadly with the era when the Piasts ruled in Płock, which was reassuring. Confirming these were, at minimum, remains from the right time period. But when researchers compared individual radiocarbon dates against the known dates of death for the person supposedly inside each container, the numbers frequently didn't match. This lined up with something historians had long suspected but never confirmed. At some point in the past, these graves had been disturbed. Coffins had been damaged. Bones had been jumbled together, sometimes mixed not just with other Piasts, but potentially with bishops and noblemen buried in the same cathedral. Centuries of careless handling had scrambled the historical record at the exact moment scientists needed it to be pristine. The situation in Warsaw was somewhat cleaner. 2 of the 4 graves there, belonging to young princes named Stanisław and Janusz III, had already been opened once, back in 1953, by a team that felt confident about the brothers' identities. When the modern team reopened these graves, their radiocarbon dating and skeletal analysis confirmed the earlier conclusions. Both brothers had died around age 24, at roughly the same time, matching the historical record, but the other 2 Warsaw graves were murkier. A stone sarcophagus, supposedly holding 2 named princes, actually contained 2 separate coffins. One held 2 skeletons that could not possibly be the princes whose names were carved into the stone. The other held a single skeleton consistent with one of the missing princes. In the end, researchers confidently identified 2 individuals in Warsaw, had a strong candidate for a third, and abandoned any hope of identifying the fourth, since no matching remains could be found at all. So this was the state of the evidence at the outset. Dozens of bones, a handful of confirmed identities, and a much larger pile of skeletons that were probably Piasts, probably from the right family, but impossible to pin to a specific historical name using dates and old records alone. This is where genetics stepped in to do what centuries of paperwork could not. The team collected samples, mostly teeth and small bone fragments, and moved them into a laboratory built specifically for handling ancient DNA, a facility physically separated from any lab working with modern human samples, with strict protocols, protective clothing, ultraviolet sterilization, and filtered air pressure systems designed to keep even a single stray strand of modern contaminant DNA from ruining a 1,000-year-old sample. This is not a minor technical detail. Ancient DNA is fragile, degraded, and present in tiny quantities. A speck of contamination from a careless researcher's own skin cells can completely corrupt a result. The entire study depended on this kind of obsessive laboratory discipline. From there, the team extracted whatever genetic material survived in the bone powder, built sequencing libraries out of it, and used a technique called targeted enrichment to fish out the specific fragments of DNA they actually needed, whether that meant the whole genome, just the mitochondrial genome passed down exclusively through mothers, or just the Y chromosome passed down exclusively through fathers. Each of these 3 genetic threads tells a different T part of the story. The whole genome can reveal ancestry and detect close family relationships. Mitochondrial DNA reveals the maternal line, unbroken, mother to daughter, stretching back generations. And the Y chromosome reveals the paternal line, father to son, which is exactly the kind of continuity you'd want to trace if you're trying to prove that a group of skeletons belongs to a single royal bloodline. Once the sequencing was done, researchers had to determine 3 things for every sample: the biological sex of the individual, their mitochondrial haplogroup, and, where possible, their Y chromosome haplogroup. A haplogroup, if you're not familiar with the term, is essentially a genetic branch on the human family tree, a cluster of people who share a common ancestor identifiable through a specific pattern of inherited mutations. 2 people sharing a rare haplogroup are very likely, at some point, related. After filtering out low-quality samples, samples with too much modern contamination, and samples that turned out to be mixtures of more than one individual, the team ended up with 17 well-preserved skeletons suitable for deep analysis. They numbered these 17 skeletons in chronological order based on their radiocarbon dates, and set about trying to match each one to a specific name from the 21 historical Piasts believed to be buried across these 2 cathedrals. This is where the detective work gets genuinely fascinating, because the scientists weren't just comparing dates, they were cross-referencing everything at once: estimated age at death from skeletal analysis, radiocarbon date ranges, kinship relationships detected through genome comparison, and known family trees pulled from centuries of Polish genealogical scholarship. Age at death alone eliminated several possibilities immediately. None of the Poick skeletons belonged to a male child, for instance, which ruled out one specific historical figure known to have died young. Differences in Y chromosome haplogroup type ruled out other pairings, since 2 men from the same direct paternal line should, in theory, share the same Y chromosome branch. One case in particular shows how powerful this kind of analysis can be. Researchers found a clear genetic connection between one skeleton, provisionally identified as a duke named Bolesław II, and another belonging to one of his supposed grandsons. But there was a problem. The 2 individuals carried completely different Y chromosome haplogroups, one from the R1b branch, one from R1a. If they were truly grandfather and grandson through an unbroken male line, they should have shared the same paternal haplogroup. They didn't. This meant either the assumed relationship was wrong, or somewhere in that line, a child had been born who was not the biological son of the man officially recorded as his father. Rather than treat this as a dead end, the researchers dug deeper into the documented genealogy and found the answer hiding in the maternal line instead. The mother of both grandsons in question was a woman named Maria of Galicia. Her own ancestry, traced back through her mother and grandmother, revealed that essentially all of her male ancestors going back at least 5 generations had also been Piasts, several of whom were direct ancestors of Bolesław II as well. In other words, even though the boys had inherited no direct male line connection to that side of the family, they had still inherited a substantial share of Piast ancestry through their mother's side, enough that the genetic kinship signal still showed up clearly in the data, just not through the paternal Y chromosome. This single piece of detective work did double duty. It explained an apparent genetic contradiction, and it independently confirmed that the skeletons really did belong to the Piast family, because the pattern of relatedness matched what the true recorded genealogy predicted almost perfectly, down to a level of detail no one could have faked or guessed. Through this painstaking process of cross-checking ages, or radiocarbon windows, kinship networks, and haplogroups against the family tree, researchers were eventually able to assign specific historical identities to at least 10 of the 17 skeletons with high or very high confidence. For the first time, real human remains could be connected, name by name, to figures known only from medieval chronicles. But identifying individual kings and princes was really just step one. The far bigger discovery was hiding in what all these skeletons had in common. Among the male skeletons, confidently identified as Piasts, the majority shared the same broad Y chromosome branch known as R1b, and more specifically, a very particular and unusually rare subbranch called R1b BY3549. This shared signature showed up not just among the historically confirmed individuals, but also among the last two Masovian Piasts, the two young brothers whose identities were never in doubt to begin with. That consistency across multiple confirmed individuals, spanning different generations and different branches of the family, is exactly what you'd expect to see if this really was the authentic, unbroken paternal signature of the entire Piast dynasty. So the researchers asked the obvious next question: where does this signature actually come from? Was it common among ordinary people living in the region when these dynasties formed, or something rarer, something that stood out? To answer that, the team turned to their own earlier research. In a previous study, they had examined the genetic makeup of people living in the same region of Central Europe, both before and during the exact period when the Piast state was forming, testing more than 150 men from that broader population. Not a single one carried this particular Piast Y chromosome lineage. If this signature had truly been common among local Slavic communities, you would expect it to show up at least occasionally in a sample that size. Its complete absence strongly suggested that the men who became Poland's first ruling dynasty were not simply the most successful family among the local population. They were something else, outsiders who arrived and then took control. The next step made the picture even sharper and, honestly, even stranger. Researchers searched existing ancient DNA databases from across Europe, looking for any other historical burial anywhere that carried the same rare paternal lineage. They found exactly 3 matches. Not 300, not 30, 3. One individual, dating to roughly 650 years before the Piast dynasty even existed, came from what is now France, associated with the Western Hallstatt culture and early Iron Age society. A second individual, dating to around 115 years after the birth of Christ, was recovered from a Roman-era cemetery in what is now the Netherlands. And the third individual, dating to somewhere around 940 years after Christ, extremely close in time to when the Piast dynasty was actively forming, was recovered from a grave identified through other evidence as most likely belonging to a Viking. Think about the geography here. This is a genetic thread connecting Iron Age France, Roman-era Netherlands, and a probable Viking burial. All of it centuries removed from Poland, none of it pointing anywhere near the region where the Piast dynasty supposedly rose up out of local soil. And yet this is the exact same rare paternal lineage carried by the men who founded and ruled the Polish kingdom. For hundreds of years, the accepted story in Poland held that the Piasts were homegrown Slavic leaders who simply outcompeted their neighbors and consolidated power locally. This is a version of the founding myth that many nations tell all about themselves. The idea that greatness rose naturally from people who already belonged to the land. But this wasn't the only theory historians had floated. Some researchers had already begun to suspect the Piasts had foreign roots, pointing to evidence that the family's early wealth came from the slave trade, an economic activity dominated at the time by Vikings rather than local Slavic populations, raising the possibility that the founders of Poland were Norse raiders rather than native chieftains. Another theory suggested the Piasts were refugees fleeing a nearby principality after it was conquered at the start of the 9th century, arriving as displaced outsiders rather than indigenous leaders. The new genetic evidence doesn't hand a clean, tidy victory to any single one of these older theories. It doesn't prove, on its own, that the Piasts were specifically Vikings, or specifically refugees from a particular conquered principality. What it does is something arguably more important. It eliminates the traditional story, the idea that the Piasts were simply local Slavic elites who rose up from within the existing population, no longer fits the physical evidence sitting inside their own tombs. Whoever these people were, their paternal ancestry traces back toward northwestern Europe, not toward the Slavic heartland they came to rule. And this connects to something the researchers found almost impossible to ignore once they stepped back and looked at the wider historical picture. The early Piast rulers were not some minor, isolated regional dynasty scraping by on the fringes of civilization. Mieszko I, the first Polish ruler ever documented in written history, was deeply entangled in the highest levels of continental power politics almost from the moment he appears in the record. According to surviving chronicles, he actively involved himself in the succession struggles for the Holy Roman Emperor's throne, throwing his support behind a specific candidate not once but twice after the deaths of two different emperors. His son, Bolesław I, later went head-to-head with the reigning Holy Roman Emperor himself in a prolonged territorial rivalry. And Mieszko's own daughter, a woman whose story alone could fill an entire documentary, became queen consort to not one but two major Scandinavian rulers in succession. First, the King of Sweden, and after his death, the king who went on to rule Denmark, Norway, and England simultaneously. Their children included kings who ruled across the North Sea world. Ask yourself honestly, does that sound like the family history of a small, freshly formed local principality, cobbled together by ambitious farmers who happened to win a few regional power struggles? Or does it sound like the family history of people who already had deep, pre-existing connections to the ruling networks of northwestern Europe? Connections that let them slot almost immediately into continental politics at the very highest level? The genetic evidence and the political behavior line up almost too neatly. Researchers now argue it's difficult to imagine that newly emerged local leaders of a small, just-forming Slavic principality would already be operating as major players in pan-European royal politics within a single generation. It makes far more sense if these people arrived already carrying influence, connections, and legitimacy from somewhere else. The story doesn't stop at Poland's borders either. Because the Piasts frequently intermarried with other major European royal families, the genetic information researchers pulled from the Piast remains rippled outward into an enormous web of connected dynasties. Using confirmed maternal lineages passed down through the Piast women who married into other royal houses, and the Piast men whose descendants married outward, scientists were able to predict the maternal genetic haplogroups for more than 200 separate historical figures across 10 major European dynasties. This list reads like a roll call of medieval European power. The Rurikids, the storied rulers of early Russia, the Arpads, founding dynasty of Hungary, the Přemyslids of Bohemia, the Hohenzollerns and the Habsburgs, two of the most dominant royal houses in later European history, the Wettins, the Angevins, the Wittelsbachs, and the Gediminids, all of them connected, at some point in their family trees, back through marriage to the House of Piast. And now, for the first time, all of them have at least a partial genetic portrait built from real, physical evidence rather than paper genealogy alone. One particular thread of this wider investigation deserves special attention because it reads almost like solving a second mystery hiding inside the first one. Researchers already knew, from a separate earlier study, the genetic profile of the Hungarian king Bela III and his wife, Anna of Antioch. Buried near this royal couple was a third unidentified skeleton, someone who shared Bela's paternal Y chromosome lineage but carried a different maternal haplogroup than either Bela or his wife. This meant the mystery individual couldn't be Bela's son or his brother. Logic suggested he was either an ancestor, like Bela's father or grandfather, or possibly a descendant, a grandson or great-grandson. The Piast research team realized they might be able to solve this Hungarian mystery using their own Polish data. Two sisters from medieval Serbia, Helena and Maria, had married into two different royal houses generations earlier. Helena became the mother of a Hungarian king named Géza II, and grandmother to Bela III himself. Maria, her sister, became the maternal grandmother of a Polish duke named Conrad I, one of the very Piasts buried in Płock Cathedral. Because mitochondrial DNA passes down unchanged from mother to child across generations, these two sisters should have shared the identical maternal haplogroup, and so should their respective grandsons. If the unidentified skeleton buried beside Bela III really was Géza II, then Conrad I over in Poland should carry that exact same maternal signature. When researchers checked the sample they had already identified as Conrad I, the match was there. Precise, down to the specific rare mutation carried by both individuals. This single genetic thread, running from a Hungarian royal tomb through a Serbian noblewoman and across into a Polish cathedral crypt, did something remarkable. It solved an open question about Hungarian royal identity and simultaneously reinforced independently that the Polish team's identification of Conrad I was correct. Two separate mysteries unraveled together using the same strand of inherited genetic code. There's one more thread worth mentioning because it stretches the story even further across the map. A daughter of Bela III and Anna of Antioch, a woman named Constance, married into the Bohemian royal family, becoming queen alongside King Ottokar I of the Přemyslid dynasty. One of their 9 children, a woman named Anne of Bohemia, later married into the Silesian branch of the Piast family. Since maternal haplogroups pass unchanged from mother to daughter, Anne of Bohemia should have carried the identical mitochondrial signature as her grandmother, Anna of Antioch. Researchers located Anne's actual grave, still intact in the Polish city of Wrocław, opened it, and tested the remains. The match was confirmed. Same rare haplogroup, passed down cleanly across 3 generations and 2 royal dynasties, exactly as the historical paper trail predicted. Taken together, all of this evidence builds something larger than just a single family's origin story. It builds a genuinely new argument about how power itself was formed across an entire region of medieval Europe during one of the most consequential centuries in the continent's history. The 10th century marked a genuine turning point, the moment when a scattering of tribal territories across Central and Eastern Europe began consolidating into the recognizable nations that would eventually shape the map of the continent. Historians have long debated whether this process of state formation was driven primarily by ambitious, local leaders rising up organically from within their own communities, or whether it was, at least in part, imposed from the outside by more powerful, better connected foreign groups who arrived and simply took charge. The genetic evidence recovered from the Piast tombs comes down firmly on the side of outside influence, at least for Poland, and researchers point out that this pattern likely wasn't unique to the Piasts. Similar arguments involving foreign or non-local origins have been proposed for the ruling dynasties of both Hungary and Kievan Rus, the medieval predecessor state to modern Russia and Ukraine, suggesting the entire wave of state formation across this part of Europe in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries may have followed a broadly similar pattern. Local populations transformed into organized kingdoms, not purely from within, but through outside groups, quite possibly linked to Viking networks then expanding trade routes and settlements across an enormous stretch of territory, from the British Isles to the edges of the Byzantine Empire. This finding challenges something deeper than just one royal family tree. It challenges a certain romantic assumption baked into how many nations tell their own founding stories, the idea that greatness must have emerged purely from the soil, purely from the people who already belonged there, without outside intervention diluting the narrative. The Piast case suggests something messier and, frankly, more historically realistic. That state formation in this era was often driven by mobile, interconnected networks of power, wealth, and marriage alliances that crossed vast distances, rather than by isolated local heroes rising up from a single, unchanging homeland. It's also worth being honest about what this research does not claim. The scientists themselves note that many questions remain open. They cannot yet prove, with total certainty, that every single generation of the Piast male line carried the same rare Y chromosome signature without a single break. Because gaps still exist for certain individuals and time periods, they have no genetic information at all about physical traits like eye color, hair color, or skin tone, so any dramatized depiction claiming to know what these rulers actually looked like remains pure speculation. And crucially, the researchers stress that biological ancestry recorded in DNA is not necessarily the same thing as official, legally recognized family history. Adultery and other unrecorded events happened across every level of medieval society, and genetics can only tell you about biological descent, not the social and legal fictions history books often present as fact. Even with those caveats in place, what this research does prove is substantial. It proves, with a rigor no amount of medieval chronicling could achieve, that a coherent group of royal skeletons buried across 2 Polish cathedrals really does represent multiple generations of a single continuous family. It proves this family carried a genetic signature vanishingly rare in the local population, both before and during Polish state formation. It proves genetic links running outward from Poland to Hungary to Bohemia, confirming centuries-old written records using nothing but bone fragments and modern sequencing. And it strongly challenges, on hard physical evidence, the idea that Poland's founding dynasty grew up organically from purely local Slavic roots. So where does that leave the story of the Piasts now? Still, in some ways, unfinished. Scientists still don't know exactly when the family's earliest ancestor first arrived in the region that would eventually become Poland, or exactly what circumstances brought him there. Was he a Viking trader who saw opportunity in a power vacuum? A mercenary leader who carved out territory by force? A displaced noble fleeing conflict elsewhere who simply landed in the right place at the right moment in history? The genetic evidence narrows the geography and rules out the traditional local origin story, but it can't yet hand us a complete narrative with a name and a specific point of departure. What the evidence does give us is something more powerful than a tidy answer. Proof that the true story of how nations get built is almost always more complicated, more connected, and more surprising than the simplified version passed down through generations of national mythology. 1,000 years ago, a family arrived somewhere in Central Europe carrying a rare genetic signature linked to communities scattered across northwestern Europe. Within a few generations, their descendants were sitting on a throne, intermarrying with the most powerful royal houses on the continent, and founding a kingdom that would shape the map of Eastern Europe for the next millennium. Whoever they really were, wherever they truly came from, one thing is now beyond dispute. The men who built Poland were never quite who Poland believed them to be, and it took modern genetics, patient archaeology, and a mountain of carefully sequenced ancient bone to finally prove it.